Hello and welcome. Earlier this month, the European Commission's top scientific advisory body issued a very important piece of advice. The report to the Commission from its group of chief scientific advisors is on a form of geoengineering technology called solar radiation modification, or SRM. SRM encompasses a couple of technologies that are receiving an increasing amount of attention. One is marine cloud brightening, which involves spraying saltwater aerosols into low clouds above marine waters to brighten the clouds and increase their reflectivity. There are currently some very small-scale tests of that approach occurring within Australia's Great Barrier Reef to investigate the potential to help rescue coral reefs from destruction. The other involves injecting light-scattering aerosols into the stratosphere so that more sunlight is reflected back into space. These technologies are receiving an increasing amount of attention, particularly the injection of aerosols into the stratosphere, for a very good reason. They might be capable of rapidly and materially, although temporarily, reducing the extent of global temperature rise. But there is a huge potential drawback. At this stage, no one knows enough about these technologies to be confident that they won't have very serious adverse consequences at a regional or even a planetary scale. As a result, there are strong scientific and expert voices on both sides of the SRM debate, and I've put quite a few links into the show notes. For example, well-known climate change scientist James Hansen was one of a number of scientists who last year wrote an open letter calling for research into the effectiveness of SRM as a tool to slow temperature rise and reduce impacts, given the dire situation in which we find ourselves. The letter says, quote, "We support a rigorous, rapid scientific assessment of the feasibility and impacts of SRM approaches, specifically because such knowledge is a critical component of making effective and ethical decisions about SRM implementation." Even the founders of Extinction Rebellion late last year suggested there should be research into marine cloud brightening in the Arctic. On the other hand, another group of scientists last month released a preprint paper called Safeguarding the Polar Regions from Dangerous Geoengineering. Their paper warns that many proposed geoengineering ideas are, quote, environmentally dangerous. And the paper says we should not be distracted from the priority of reducing emissions. The scientific debate about SRM research is one thing. But there is another crucial part to this, and that's the ethics and governance side. Who should decide whether or in what circumstances SRM, or even SRM research, should be allowed to proceed? And how should it be regulated? And what should the guardrails be? Today you'll hear from someone who has devoted quite a few years to thinking about the governance issues associated with SRM. János Pastor has had an impressive career so far. For example, in the lead-up to the landmark 2015 climate COP in France that resulted in the Paris Agreement, he was UN Assistant Secretary-General for Climate Change and Senior Advisor on Climate Change to then UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon. Prior to that, he held very senior roles at environment group WWF International, which included the position of WWF's Director of Policy and Science. And he has also held senior executive roles with the UN Environment Programme, known as UNEP, and with the Secretariat to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Our discussions today will focus on a more recent role, which was under the auspices of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative and was focused on governance issues around SRM. Welcome, János.
Thank you very much for having me.
First up, if I can ask you a question that I ask everybody I interview. You've had a stellar career. Can I ask you, what are you most proud of in your working life so far?
It's difficult to answer that question because I've been in this business for close to 5 decades now, and I must say I'm quite proud of many things. But maybe I'll focus on the most recent experience. My leading the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative C2G, partly because it's relevant to the discussion we're about to have, but also because both at a personal level and as a leader of a team, I think I'm really proud of what we did in the last 7 years because we've achieved something quite unique. At a personal level, I think it was fantastic because I could make use of all the experience that I have gained in the previous 4 decades about science and policy analysis of an important issue that was actually quite new at that time, and it still is. I could make use of my diplomatic experience, intergovernmental experience, as well as working in non-state actors, NGOs, team building and management, fundraising. So all of that personally I could make use of. But what is most important, I think, is that we as a team at C2G, we actually achieved, I think, something unique. And in spite of many odds, including COVID during the middle of our work, we managed to put solar radiation modification governance on the agenda. And of governments and of many non-state actors as well.
I can easily understand why that broad range of skills would have to be brought to bear to do this. Diplomatic, scientific, and working with a very large network of all sorts of people. But can I ask you, what made you decide to devote yourself to this issue of SRM governance?
Yeah, so back in 2016, when I retired from the UN and I was ready to start reflecting and maybe doing some writing and about all kinds of climate change issues. And while I was happy about the outcomes of the Paris conference in the sense of it was important and moving forward, I knew it wasn't enough. And then I got a phone call from a foundation, and I was asked, would I be interested to start an initiative looking at the governance issues related to these new emerging so-called geoengineering technologies. And, I thought about it for about 30 seconds, and I said, yes, I would be. Because it was something that was out there. I didn't know much about it, but I knew enough that it was an issue. And I said, yes, of course I would be interested, especially if, and this was part of our discussion, if we could do it in a way that it would be impartial about the use or not use of these technologies.
Yes. Why was that important?
Because for the purpose of the C2G as we originally designed it was to bring to the attention of governments, to some extent other players as well, but to bring to the attention of governments some of the governance challenges and opportunities related to geoengineering, including large-scale carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. Now, you cannot do that if you're promoting the technology, or you cannot do that if you're against the technology. So we set ourselves to be clear that, that we would be following a impartial path about the use or not of these technologies. But that doesn't mean that we were neutral when it came to climate change, to addressing the climate change, addressing it in the context of sustainable development, and so on and so forth, the various agreements that governments have made over the years.
We've just had a major report come out from the European Commission's Scientific Advisory Group. For you, what are the most important elements of that report?
Well, I'm still reading it because it only came out 2 days ago. But I think from the brief reading that I have done so far, what is important is it recognizes that this is an issue that we need to study, we need to look at the pros and cons, and there are pros and cons. But potentially, it could have a major benefit, i.e., cooling the planet. But potentially, it could have risks which we need to study and better understand. So, what is being proposed is a process to go forward, to study it, to also have consultations in society, and review the situation every 5-10 years. So to me, this is a very reasonable way to move this debate forward. I think this report is going to be considered quite important as people really read it and as governments start considering it. So I welcome the report, and I look forward to lots of discussions about it and moving forward.
Do you agree with all its recommendations?
Yes. Yes, I do. It's a very reasonable way forward. It's not about being for or against solar radiation modification. It's really about how to deal with it.
Yeah. And it does introduce, I think, suggest a permitting regime for research, and also some form of discussions or negotiations on regulatory instruments to govern decision making.
Exactly, but it's also quite important that it addresses the issue of a moratorium on the deployment of solar radiation modification until we have better information about the risks and benefits.
Yeah, which is, as you say, crucial. Before we go back to governance, let me ask you a couple of questions about the technology itself so we can get a better sense of what it involves. Can SRM, and by that I mean aerosol injection into the stratosphere, can it be done regionally in crucial locations? Can you is there the prospect of targeting it, for example, to polar regions?
Okay, so let's just be clear about terminology. So when we talk about SRM, that is solar radiation modification, we're actually talking about a range of technologies, including what you mentioned in your introduction, marine cloud brightening, also stratospheric aerosol injection, but also at the two extremes, surface or ocean level modifications, or going into space and doing space-based activities. Now, we can look at these if you like in more detail, but the point is that there is a range of options, and now each of these options have different opportunities to be used at a local, regional, or global level. If you're talking about stratospheric aerosol injection, then generally one is talking about a global application with global impacts, not necessarily equal in different locations in the world, but still having global impacts. Sometimes there are indications of, and there have been some papers published on hemispheric application of stratospheric aerosol injection. But even in those cases, when the focus is on a hemisphere, such as the northern hemisphere, for example, there will be substantial global impacts everywhere in the world. So even the hemispheric one cannot be looked at just as hemispheric, but it will be global. Marine cloud brightening, on the other hand, is something much more regional or even local. You mentioned that it is being experimented with for the event potential protection of the Great Barrier Reef. There are also discussions of using the same technology to protect the Arctic. Again, these are big regions, but there are potential possibilities there. Of course, if you jump to the space-based, then it becomes again global, and the entire Earth and Earth system will be impacted.
Do these technologies, or any of these technologies, have the capacity to prevent emissions overshoot? Because I think there's increasing recognition that, okay, we're not going to just stay within 1.5, but there is a hope that we could overshoot and then come back. However, we're getting new research which tells us that, overshoot is no walk in the park. There are very serious ramifications from that. So does SRM or any particular SRM technology, do you think, have the capacity to prevent emissions overshoot?
So again, let's be clear about terminology.
Temperature overshoot.
Yes, exactly. Because generally, overshoot is a terminology used by the IPCC,
Yes.
and it refers to temperature overshoot.
Yeah.
So yes, SRM can limit temperature overshoot. In fact, that is the main reason why scientists suggest that SRM should be considered, because it could reduce the temperature overshoot in terms of the growth of the temperature and the increasing temperature, and maintain it at a certain level, or even reduce it to a certain level. In fact, stratospheric aerosol injection is the only technique known at the moment that can do this reasonably rapidly. So that's why scientists are considering it. Now, what you have is basically you have greenhouse gas emissions, okay, that have changed the radiative balance of the Earth. And now stratospheric aerosol injection would be used to intervene, but with the opposite effect. And so that's the thing is that both the actual greenhouse gas emissions and the stratospheric aerosol injection are anthropogenic interventions in the climate system. The difference is that stratospheric aerosol injection would be intentional. It would be intentional to change the climate. Now, one could argue, and some have argued, that since we have good knowledge of the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions, and since the agreement in the United Nations, for example, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, all emissions of greenhouse gases could also be considered as intentional. Well, there's a debate about that, but that's something worth mentioning here.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I ask you how this technology would be, and by I mean stratospheric injection of aerosols, how would that be experienced on Earth by humans? I mean, and what could the impact be on the natural environment and planetary systems?
Yeah, so let's start with the context of the context in which one would consider and one could make use of stratospheric aerosol injection, and that's the warming. So we have now the average warming is 1.3 degrees centigrade above the historical average. The Paris goal is 1.5. This year last year was just below 1.5. 2024 is going to be a little bit above 1.5, so it's not very good. And according to some decent estimates of the UN Environment Program, the present trends indicate that we'll be at 2.6 to 3.1 by the end of the century. So that is the context in which we're looking at stratospheric aerosol injection. So the first impact is a positive impact. It's the lowering of the temperature, and that would reduce the various warming-related risks, not necessarily in a linear fashion, and we can talk about the detail, but nevertheless, the positive impact is the one that one has to start with, because otherwise you wouldn't worry about stratospheric aerosol injection if you didn't have this positive impact. Now, in terms of the negative impacts that one might observe, or one might feel, or one might be able to monitor, start with the color of the sky. There will be a slight change in the color. It's not clear how much it would be observable by individuals, but there will be some changes, and the light will become a little bit more diffused. That will have an impact on plants as well, on photosynthesis. Not necessarily negative, but there will be impacts, and there are some papers that are looking at that already. An important negative impact will depend on what material is used for the aerosol. If it's sulfur-based, then it will have negative impacts on the ozone layer, and that's serious, of course, and we need to take that into account.
Yes.
And it will also end up as acid rain because eventually whatever you inject in the stratosphere will come down. Now, there have been some papers looking at it, and I understand there is some new ones coming out literally as we are recording this podcast, looking at this in a more quantitative manner. But nevertheless, these are impacts that have to be considered. Now, another important impact is that while stratospheric aerosol injection, according to scientists, it's pretty clear that it will be able to bring down the temperature or stop the growth of the temperature increase. But there will be changes in the climate, and it's not like we're going to go back to the climate that we had before warming. And this is something that is very important to recognize, that yes, the temperature may go back to what it was before, but the climate will not go back to what it was before in terms of precipitation, winds, and their timing and so on. There could be changes, and some of it we have some ideas, but we don't know very well, and this is part of the information that will still need to be researched to have a better understanding of what those changes will be. And then one more important physical impact, and that's referred to as the termination shock, that if one were to start stratospheric aerosol injection and do that for some years, and at some point in the future somebody decides, no, we're not going to do that anymore, or there will be changes in economic, social, political context, suddenly the whole exercise is brought to a quick conclusion, and then suddenly the temperature will rise up to what it would have been otherwise, assuming that in the meantime, the greenhouse gas concentrations were not reduced substantially. So, and that, of course, that shock to the ecosystems could be quite substantial. So that's something one needs to think about when devising governance frameworks for this technology.
Yes.
And I must add that in addition to these physical impacts that can be all quantified one way or another, there are a whole series of non-quantifiable impacts that are very important. And they relate to fear. People may fear this technology. People may think that this is just hubris. We're trying to play God. And, these are considerations that people have, and they need to be taken into account. And then there are also the so-called unknown unknowns. How we are about to, if we were to make use of this technology, we would be manipulating the one global atmosphere that we have. We cannot mess this up.
Yes.
And so we have to be absolutely sure that there are no unknown unknowns out there that could end up messing up the situation. And then, if I may,
sure.
If I may, just to finish this discussion of the risks and benefits, I think it's very important with this new technique in particular to look at the risks of doing, and the benefits, of course, versus the risks and benefits of not doing, because that's ultimately what society has to look at. It's right now what we see is warming with huge impacts, some catastrophic already at this level of warming. With increased warming, there will be more of those. So one has to look at the risks and benefits of this new technique versus the risks and benefits of not using this technique. And that is a big challenge that has to be looking at both these quantifiable and the non-quantifiable risks and benefits.
You mentioned there people's emotional response to this. What are the range of reactions that you get from people when you talk about this possibility? And is it possible to generalize? Is there a general reaction you get when you fully explain to people the range of issues that are involved in thinking about this?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the response covers a rather big range, and that the situation is quite polarized. between those who think that this is the best thing since apple pie and Coke, and those who think, oh, absolutely not, over our dead bodies. So there is really a very big range. Although I think that in the last few years it's less so than it was, but still the debate is highly polarized. And but I think part of the problem of the polarized debate is that we have insufficient knowledge of this technology. So many of the reactions linked to what we were just talking about before, it's about fear, it's about these kinds of issues, but without actually having a good enough information base of what are the risks, what are the benefits, and what are the governance challenges and opportunities. So many of the reactions that one hears in discussing these issues is based more on ideology, it's based more on feelings, and rarely on actual evidence. So we do need societal conversations.
Yeah, because there I mean, those things are important, as you mentioned, but also it's because we don't have the evidence. That's your point, isn't
Well,
it?
we have some evidence, and even that evidence often doesn't end up in the discussions because we haven't had enough societal conversations. So what we have is we have positions of NGOs, positions of certain government representatives, although we don't really have positions of governments yet on this, expressed in formal ways. And those are the positions that are based more on ideology and feelings and less on actual evidence.
Can I ask you, in your view, what are the most important governance considerations?
Ooh, there are many, and maybe just to be clear about the context in which these important governance considerations come forward. So when we talk about governance, we're not just talking about governments regulating. We are talking about the whole of society working toward, or for that matter, against certain goals. And that includes formal and informal governance processes. So let's be clear about that. That's part of it.
Yeah.
The second, which is what I mentioned already, but I think it's important that the governance of solar radiation modification is being done in the context of a warming world. And there's no point in talking about SRM if the world is not warming, right?
Yes.
So that's it goes without saying in a way, but it has to be said. So in that context, I think I would suggest maybe 4 particularly challenging governance areas that we have to deal with, and maybe 2 additional sort of addenda to those 4. So the first one goes to something we've already alluded to, and that is to have information available about who is doing what. Because activities are taking place on this issue by non-state actors, by some government offices, but also by the private sector. So there are activities, and it is not clear. We don't have a source of trusted information about who is doing what, where, with what money, what kind of technology, and so on and so forth. So that's number 1, is to have an information base about activities. The number 2, which I've already referred to before, but I think it's very important, is to have broad societal conversations based on evidence, including the whole of society, about these issues. And we haven't had, I would say, almost any on this. And I think this is really important, because ultimately it's going to affect everybody one way or another if we were to use it. So let's have those conversations. And for that to happen, we also need our leaders in government, but also leaders in civil society, private sector, academia, to actually talk much more seriously about the warming that is coming, and the impacts of that warming, and the kinds of things we can do about that warming, which is not happening. Honestly, our leaders are not doing this either at all or only just a very little bit, when in fact
Yes.
we need to be focusing much more than that. So the second one is the societal conversations. The third one is that if we don't know enough, then we have to have research to have better information about the risks, benefits, and the governance challenges of these technologies. But we need also governance of research, because, first of all, not enough research is taking place. Relatively very small amount of research is taking place in this area. But we also need to make sure that whatever research takes place within guardrails to ensure safety for ecosystems and for human beings and for the economy. And of course, having that kind of research, it's also important part of the governance to make sure that the outcomes of the research are made available in a way that can help the societal conversations. So that's the third one. The fourth one, and that's a tricky one, and at some point the world has to take a decision, or may have to take a decision, whether or not to actually make use of solar radiation and I'm thinking here of the stratospheric aerosol injection type.
Yeah.
And it's not clear how that kind of decision could take place. So we need a process, a governance process, to get us there. Now, some people might say it's too early to do that. In my view, it is not too early. And it has to co-evolve with the evolution of the science, the technology that we need and that we're seeing. Also, there are views out there, and there are different views, I will state that, but some scientists are saying that if ever the world wants to make use of stratospheric aerosol injection, then don't wait until the temperature is 2.5 to 3 degrees above historical average and tens of thousands of people are dying and islands will have disappeared, but do it now to avoid all those additional catastrophic impacts. Now, meaning in the near future. So the timing of this decision shouldn't be left for a very long time ahead, but something in the coming years. Now, where such process should take place, in what body, should it be in the UN, but in which UN body, if not in the UN, where? These are the kinds of issues that governments need to discuss. And also on what information base. We don't really have. The IPCC has addressed these to some extent, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but still, we need to be clear about the information base. And of course, included in there, and this is, we come back to the report from the European Commission, but it would be very important as part of this process to have clarity that there will be a moratorium on deployment until certain conditions are met, and those conditions would have to be clarified. So these are the four major governance steps. And I said that in addition to these four, I'd like to put two addenda, which I think are quite important. Depending on the outcome of the decision-making about whether or not, there are two important follow-up governance challenges. In case the answer is yes, then there are some huge governance challenges ahead about how to set up an institution to actually deliver the stratospheric aerosol injection. Who will do it, on whose behalf, who will set the global thermostat, who will take care of those that are negatively affected, because the impact will be global but not necessarily equal, so some will be better off than others. And then also how to ensure to reduce or eliminate the so-called moral hazard, to make sure that by using this technique we don't stop emission reductions, which of course remains the priority for climate action. And then, some even say that it's actually ungovernable, this technology. So is it really ungovernable, and how do we make this happen? Now, this is for the yes answer to if the governments decide to make use of stratospheric aerosol injection. But if the decision is no, then there are equally challenging governance processes ahead on how to then deal with the warming world, because there are not so many options to do that. And that will be those two follow-up governance challenges that will depend very much on whether the answer is yes or no.
That is a very complicated set of governance issues to deal with. One of them you mentioned there was the need to not take our eye off the ball in terms of a focus on emissions reduction. I imagine that is a criticism that you run into quite a bit, that this just could give the fossil fuel industry an out to keep polluting at the expense of the entire planet, that it does allow that people to put less attention into reducing emissions. What's your response to that?
Well, it is a risk, and it's something that one needs to deal with. And it could, whether it will or not, that depends on the governance frameworks we put in place to ensure that it doesn't happen, or to reduce the extent to which it might happen. Now, I don't want to make it look like that I think the fossil fuel industry is not to blame here. But I think much more important to blame here is us, in terms of the world, the societies who are allowing the fossil fuel companies to do what they're doing. Now, in practical terms, if ever stratospheric aerosol injection were to be considered, it actually has to be considered together in a common frame with emission reductions, adaptation, and carbon removal, because ultimately these things hang together. And there was a report by the so-called Global Overshoot Commission last year, in 2023, where for the first time a commission of this nature brought together the issues of carbon removal, emission reductions, carbon removal, adaptation, and solar radiation modification. And without addressing the specifics of what the Commission proposed, but the idea of pulling this together into one framework is, I think, the most important way to ensure that this moral hazard is reduced or eliminated completely.
You mentioned there the work of it's the Global Overshoot Commission. Is that what it's called? We have forums like the IPCC, the scientific body, the global scientific body that advises on climate change. We have the UN climate COP processes. To what extent have they given consideration to SRM?
So the IPCC has dealt with this in different ways. Already during the fifth assessment report, it had even a special meeting on geoengineering. And also in the sixth assessment report, there is considerable discussion of in particular solar radiation modification, but also carbon removal. So it's there. Now, what happens in the IPCC is that sometimes the scientists have considerable analysis of these issues, and you find many, many pages worth of material in the detailed reports, but some of those ideas either are lost completely, or it's hard to find in the summaries for policymakers, which of course what most people read. And I think that's true for a lot of the SRM related discussions in the sixth assessment report, but it's there. So if you look for it, you can find it. And if you are ever looking for a summary of what the sixth assessment report said on these issues, you can find relevant reports on C2G's website that is still available publicly. Now, I do expect that the seventh assessment report will address these issues, and we'll see this is all happening as we speak. As far as the UNFCCC is concerned, it has not been on the agenda of the Conference of the Parties of the COP, but what we have seen is an increasing discussion of SRM in the side events. There's also a debate not on the agenda of the UNFCCC, but by people involved in the UNFCCC about the so-called Article 2 of the convention, which is the main objective of the UNFCCC treaty about treating anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And there is a legal debate and a practical debate on whether how to interpret that and whether that could consider solar radiation modification to be discussed in the UNFCCC. At a practical level, when you look at what's been happening in the UNFCCC, it's very much focused on mitigation and adaptation and climate finance, and somebody has to do that, so that's super important. But in the end, like I suggested before, there will have to be a bringing together of considering the mitigation, the emission reductions, the carbon removal, adaptation, and potentially modification of solar radiation, all of these to be brought in a common agenda. And there I do see a role for the UNFCCC, but it will require sort of, how should I put it, outside push. It will not happen easily within the UNFCCC process as we know it. Now, beyond the UN,
Sure.
Go ahead.
No, go. Well, I was going to ask you, I mean, we talk about keeping 1.5 alive, and at Baku, there was sort of a feeling that, we're still being said, but the head of the IPCC, Jim Ski, said, it's hanging by the goal of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 is hanging by a very slender thread. Do you think it will be long before the scientists, like at that IPCC level, will be saying, if you want to keep it alive, then you need to look at things like this? Well, do you expect to hear that explicit message soon?
So first, let's be clear. You said the scientist IPCC. The IPCC is two things. One is the scientific work, which comes together in these very long and detailed reports. And then there are the governments who, line by line, agree on the policymaker's summary. And that is more than science, right? That is how the governments look at science. And so when you say the scientist, you mean what they say in the detailed assessment or what will come out in the summary for policymakers. And there's a big difference, okay?
Yeah, go on.
When it comes to the temperature, and let me also put my what I hope will happen before I actually answer your question. I think it's very important to have the 1.5 degree goal because there are very good physical boundaries that are linked to the 1.5 degree. And if we pass the 1.5 degree, we begin to reach these tipping points and other serious impacts. So the 1.5 degree is very important. But it's also important to realize that we're already burning through the 1.5 degree goal. So yes, it's important to have it at least to have a goal to which we can come back to at some point in the future. But the reality is, and this is where I'm quite concerned about some of the public messaging about 1.5 degree, keeping it alive, hanging by a thread. The reality is that last year was just about below 1.5. This year is going to be just above 1.5. And the temperature is not about to be reduced in 2025 either. So the reality is that even the average is increasing, the 20-30-year average that climate scientists use. So for me, it's no point in focusing on keeping 1.5 alive, but rather seeing how we can increase the ambition to actually have an impact on the global temperature. And the challenge that we have is that even under the best of scenarios that countries are able to show through their nationally determined contributions, their national climate plans, are simply not going fast enough. And the carbon removal that is necessary, according to the assessment from the IPCC, is going too slowly. So the reality is that it will get a lot warmer than 1.5. That's the world that we're facing.
Yes, which is a terrible prospect. You've been looking at this issue for a long time. How have your own views changed over that time? What does the Janosch of today think about SRM? That the Janosch that first was asked to look at governance issues around SRM didn't know or wasn't aware of?
Well, first of all, I have learned a lot about what SRM is and what it isn't, because it's really important. The isn't is actually in some ways more important than what it is, because it isn't part of the solution. Let's be absolutely clear. And that's something we haven't yet discussed. But yes, it could help in reducing the warming impacts for a certain period of time, but it is not part of the solution. The only solution to the climate crisis is the reduction of emissions and the removal of excess carbon from the atmosphere. That's the only solution. So what I've learned, and what I hope to also transmit this message to others, is that no, it's not a solution, but it can help the temperature impacts for a certain period of time, almost like an emergency measure, like a Band-Aid, something that we may need for a certain period of time while the world is decarbonizing. But the solution is not SRM, it is the decarbonization. So
Yes.
that's one thing I have learned. The other thing that I have learned over the years, it's when we started working on SRM governance with the C2G team back in 2016, 2017, people didn't want to talk about this. They say, oh, this is science fiction. Are you from a different planet? What is this? And this has changed. This has completely changed. It's not that suddenly the interlocutors we were talking to, for example, last year, suddenly they changed their view that they're positive and yes, we must use SRM. But the situation has changed in that representatives are now aware of this technology, broadly speaking, and they are increasingly prepared to talk about it. And what we saw in the report, the European Commission report that you started this conversation with, is precisely that there is more and more interest to have conversation about it. Now, and then I come to the more difficult question of what János Pásztor has learned over the last 7 years. Is this a technology we should be looking at seriously? And when I started this work, I really thought this was really terrible to even think about a technology like this. This is the unthinkable. And but when you see the way the world is evolving, and that while there are successes in emission reduction, in solar power and wind power and all this, it's simply not going fast enough. So we are facing, and I am facing, a world with increasing impacts of climate change. And then the question really arises, what are the options to reduce those impacts? And yes, we need to do much more adaptation to those changes, but we already see how difficult it is to adapt to the current levels of climate change. So I guess what I'm saying is that I have personally not come to a conclusion that yes, we must use it, or no, we should be against it. But we really have to seriously consider this option and see how whether making use of it compared to not making use of it will end up in a better world, or at least a less worse world than where we're heading today.
So in a way, we could be going from the unthinkable due to our own inertia, our own lack of action. We could be going from the unthinkable to perhaps even the unavoidable. I'm getting the impression that we're not there yet, but we're certainly not heading in the right direction at this stage, are we?
May I correct? I think we are going in the right direction, but not fast enough. And
Yeah.
if we're, as Bill Kibben said a few years ago, in the area of climate change, going slowly is losing.
Yes.
And this is the problem, that we're not going fast enough. And since we're not going fast enough, this kind of technology may be the unavoidable.
Yes.
And this is an important issue that we need to think about. Can we still avoid it? I think we can still avoid it, but we need to get our act together, which I don't see yet.
Let's look forward. We've just looked over the last 7 years, but let's look forward, János. Where would you hope that we would be, say, in 2 years' time, in terms of both making those decisions about governance or exploring them further, and I guess also in terms of thinking about SRM research?
Well, I would hope that 2 years is very short time.
I
when
know,
it comes to
János,
governance issues,
but we do have to move fast, as you say.
I agree. We need to move fast. So what I would hope is that in the 2 years coming, that there will actually be substantial advances in those 4 areas that I have described, and at least on the first 3, because many of us in our respective jobs and in our respective situations, we can advance conversations. Yes, we can do that. We can have it at the level of our local town where we live. We can have it nationally. We can have it internationally. So let's have as much conversation about this as possible. I think that's something we can advance in the next 2 years. I think it's really important to advance the conversation on research governance. Now, that doesn't have to be an international treaty on SRM research. We can advance research governance in many different ways. We have important academic NGOs like the International Science Council that can address these issues. We have the scientific advisory body of the UN Secretary General. We have many different places where the World Meteorological Organization and so on, where this discussion can move forward without necessarily requiring an international treaty about it. So I think those are areas where we should be able to move forward even in the next 2 years. And if there are ways that one can start at least the embryo of discussions about where and how eventually decision-making might appear at the global level on whether or not to make use of stratospheric aerosol injection, I think that would be good. I don't think we'll achieve a clarity in 2 years, but we can certainly have ideas that come up in that period of time.
One final question, János. What fact do you wish was more widely known as we aim for a cleaner, greener, better world?
Okay, so we've sort of talked about this, but not explicitly during this interview. So I think most of us will agree on the need for the world to move on the sustainable path forward, which means renewable energy, low carbon systems, sustainable agriculture, different urban planning, and so on and so forth. It's about lifestyles, consumption patterns, all of what the sustainable development goals are about. So that's what we need to do. But there is a problem. We have a problem that we have polluted the atmosphere way too much. We haven't started reducing emissions 30 years ago the way we should have. So the atmosphere is in bad shape. And even if we stop all emissions tomorrow, which of course is not possible, but even if we did that, the global temperature would still rise a little bit and then stabilize at that level, which means that the impacts that we have at this temperature level will remain with us for hundreds of years to come. This is the situation where we're in. So we need, in addition to the sustainable path, we need a correction path, corrective measures to clean up, to get back to where we started with. And that means large-scale carbon dioxide removal, removing excess carbon from the atmosphere, and maybe also the direct cooling through solar radiation modification. But these are different. The corrective path is different from the sustainable path, and there are not too many places where they actually meet. So this is important conceptually, because very often when we talk about these issues, people say, oh no, we can't talk about SRM, we have to reduce emissions. Of course we have to reduce emissions. That is the priority. But we also have to clean up, we have to correct our past mistakes.
That's a wonderful response. Thank you so much, Janosch, and thanks very much for a great interview. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'm Murray Griffin, a Melbourne-based communications consultancy, earthed.au. If you found this episode interesting, follow the show to be notified of upcoming interviews with people working for decarbonisation, nature repair, and a better world. See you next time.